It was a crisp Monday morning in the heart of Riverdale, a small but bustling town where life thrived on routine. The town's most beloved coffee shop, the Corner Bean, sat on the busiest corner of Main Street. It was a hub of warmth and conversation, a place where the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the hum of chatter and the faint clatter of cups. People streamed in and out, seeking their morning caffeine fix or simply stopping by to savor a moment of connection. The shop's owner, Tim Holden, had worked hard to make the Corner Bean a staple of the community. A man in his late 40s with a weathered face and a steady demeanor, Tim was as unassuming as they came. He didn't talk much about himself, preferring to let his coffee-welcoming environment speak for him. But beneath his quiet exterior lay a man with layers, experiences, and beliefs that few could claim to fully know. This particular morning, Tim decided to visit his shop incognito. It wasn't something he did often, but he enjoyed blending in with his customers now and then, observing the world he had helped shape. Dressed in his usual jeans and jacket, he topped off his look with a red baseball cap embroidered with the bold, unmistakable letters, MAGA. Tim wasn't overtly political, but he believed in standing by his principles, and the hat was a quiet, personal statement. As Tim entered the cafe, he noticed how packed it was. The aroma of espresso and vanilla wafted through the air, and the lively atmosphere enveloped him like a familiar embrace. He quietly joined the line, glancing at the menu even though he knew it by heart. Behind the counter stood Sarah, a spirited young barista with bright eyes and an outspoken personality. Sarah was a recent hire, full of energy and passionate about her beliefs, though sometimes her zeal got the better of her. Tim watched as Sarah skillfully prepared a latte for a customer, her movements quick and precise. But when her gaze landed on him, something shifted. Her expression stiffened as her eyes zeroed in on his hat. For a brief moment, Tim thought she might not recognize him. It wasn't uncommon for employees to be unfamiliar with their boss's face if they mainly dealt with managers. "Next," Sarah called, her tone sharper than usual. Tim stepped forward, offering her a polite smile. "Good morning. I'll have a medium black coffee, please." Sarah hesitated, her hands frozen mid-motion as she stared at him. The room seemed to quiet slightly, as if the air had grown heavier. A few nearby customers turned their heads, sensing the tension. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice firm but edged with discomfort. "We don't serve people wearing that kind of hat here." For a moment, Tim thought he'd misheard her. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Around them, the cafe grew quieter still, the murmur of conversation giving way to curious silence. "I beg your pardon?" Tim asked, his tone calm but edged with disbelief. Sarah crossed her arms, her resolve visibly strengthening. "I said we don't serve people wearing that hat. It's offensive, and it goes against the values of this shop." Tim could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, some sympathetic, others judgmental. A flush of heat crept up his neck, but Tim could feel the eyes of everyone in the shop on him, some curious, some sympathetic, and others sharply critical. It was the kind of moment that could escalate in a heartbeat, but instead of reacting impulsively, he took a deep breath. The words Sarah had spoken weren't just about a coffee order, they were a challenge, a test of character and conviction. He looked at her, studying the determination etched across her young face. She truly believed she was standing up for something meaningful. "I see," Tim said evenly, the calm in his voice masking the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. He hesitated, considering his next words carefully. "And may I ask why you feel this hat is offensive?" "It's not about the hat," Sarah said, though her tone betrayed her agitation. "It's what it represents: division, hatred, and policies that hurt people. This coffee shop is supposed to be a safe space, a place for inclusion and kindness. That hat doesn't belong here." The conviction in her voice was undeniable, but so was the weight of the misunderstanding that hung between them. Tim wasn't the type to wear his politics on his sleeve, much less on his head, without reason. To him, the hat wasn't a symbol of exclusion, it was a representation of his belief in hard work, perseverance, and the pursuit of better opportunities for everyone. But explaining that in a moment like this wouldn't be easy, and he knew it wouldn't be well received by everyone. Behind him, a murmur rippled through the crowd. A few customers exchanged glances, whispering amongst themselves. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed to silently cheer Sarah on. Tim caught fragments of their words. "Good for her," one person muttered. "Why make a scene over coffee?" asked another. Tim decided not to push further, at least, not yet. "Thank you for sharing your perspective," he said, his voice steady. "But I think you might want to reconsider your position, for your own sake as much as mine." "What's that supposed to mean?" Sarah asked, her arms still crossed tightly across her chest. Tim offered her a small, almost knowing smile. "Nothing yet. But maybe we'll revisit this conversation later." He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture both respectful and ironic, before stepping out of line and making his way toward the corner of the shop. Though Sarah clearly hadn't recognized him, several of the other employees had. Their wide eyes followed him as he walked, and a low buzz of realization began to spread among the staff. Tim nodded briefly at Mark, the manager, who stood frozen near the back counter, clearly unsure how to handle what had just transpired. Tim gave him a quick gesture that seemed to say, "Let it play out." As he sat down at a small table near the window, Tim couldn't help but reflect on how the day had taken such an unexpected turn. He had opened the Corner Bean nearly 8 years ago, pouring every ounce of his savings and energy into building it from the ground up. The shop had been his dream, a gathering place for the community, where people of all backgrounds could come together over something as simple as a cup of coffee. In the early days, it hadn't been easy. Competition from corporate coffee chains loomed large, and Tim had struggled to carve out a niche for his small, independent shop. But he'd persevered, winning over the town with his commitment to quality, warmth, and a sense of belonging. Over time, the Corner Bean had become more than just a business, it was a symbol of what the community could achieve when people supported one another. And yet, here he was, being refused service in his own establishment. Tim shook his head slightly at the irony of it all. The MAGA hat had never been a staple of his wardrobe, but he'd started wearing it occasionally as a quiet reminder to himself of the values he held dear, values that had guided him through the highs and lows of his life. It wasn't about politics for him, not really. It was about resilience, faith, and the belief that everyone should have the chance to thrive. But Sarah didn't know that. To her, the hat was a symbol of something entirely different, and she was acting out of a sense of duty to uphold the ideals she thought the shop represented. Tim could see that, even if he didn't agree with her approach. From his seat, he watched as the tension in the room began to dissipate. Customers returned to their conversations, and the line moved forward again. Sarah, still visibly flustered, continued taking orders, her jaw tight and her movements brisk. Tim noticed Mark approaching her, leaning in to whisper something in her ear. She froze for a moment, then turned her head ever so slightly to glance in Tim's direction. Her expression flickered with confusion, but she quickly recovered, straightening her shoulders and returning to her work. Tim decided to let her finish her shift before addressing the situation directly. He wanted to see how she would handle herself, both in the face of potential backlash and as she processed the realization of who he was. He also knew that this moment wasn't just about him and Sarah, it was a microcosm of the broader divides and misunderstandings that had been rippling through the country. For now, he waited, sipping a coffee brought to him by another employee who had recognized him and silently placed the cup on his table without a word. Tim appreciated the gesture but knew the real challenge was yet to come. As the morning unfolded, he could feel the weight of the situation settling over him. This wasn't just about a hat or a single interaction. It was about the culture of the shop he had built, the principles it stood for, and the way it could weather the storm of conflict without losing its soul. For Tim, the path forward wasn't entirely clear, but one thing was certain: the choices he made next would define not just the future of the corner bean but the values it would uphold for years to come. As the morning rush began to subside, the cafe settled into its mid-morning rhythm. Tim remained in his corner seat, quietly observing the ebb and flow of customers. He could see Sarah throwing the occasional glance in his direction, her expression a mix of suspicion and curiosity. She clearly hadn't pieced together who he was yet, but the gears in her mind were turning. Meanwhile, Mark, the manager, seemed to be pacing nervously behind the counter, stealing furtive looks toward Tim. The tension that had filled the shop earlier hadn't entirely dissipated, it had merely shifted to an undercurrent, a quiet unease that lingered in the air. Tim decided it was time to stir the waters a bit more. He rose from his table, taking his half-empty cup of coffee with him, and made his way to the counter. The other baristas noticed his approach first, their eyes widening slightly. One of them, Mia, who had worked at the corner bean for years, opened her mouth to greet him but hesitated, clearly unsure how to address the situation. Tim gave her a reassuring nod and gestured toward Sarah, who was now focused on steaming milk for a latte. "Excuse me," Tim said in a calm but firm tone. Sarah turned to face him, and for a split second, her professional mask slipped, revealing a flicker of annoyance. "Yes?" she asked, her voice clipped. Tim held up his cup. "This coffee is excellent. Compliments to the team." Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected comment. Thank you," she said, her tone softening slightly but still guarded. "But I couldn't help noticing," Tim continued, his voice steady, "that earlier, you refused to serve me because of my hat. I'd like to understand your reasoning a bit more. You mentioned this shop's values. Can you elaborate?" Sarah straightened her posture, clearly bracing herself for a confrontation. "Like I said earlier, this is supposed to be a place where everyone feels safe. That hat, it represents a lot of things that make people uncomfortable. It stands for division and discrimination. I didn't think it was right to serve someone who supports those kinds of ideas." Tim nodded slowly, as if genuinely considering her words. "I see. And you feel it's your responsibility to enforce what this shop stands for?" "Yes," Sarah replied firmly. "I believe it's important to stand up for what's right, even if it means making tough decisions." Tim took a sip of his coffee, letting her words hang in the air for a moment. "That's a commendable principle," he said finally. "Standing up for what you believe in is never easy. But let me ask you this, what happens if the person you're standing against doesn't represent the things you assume they do?" Sarah frowned, clearly taken aback. "What do you mean?" Tim leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so only she and a few nearby employees could hear. "What if the person you refuse to serve isn't who you think they are? What if, instead of being a symbol of division, they've spent their life trying to bring people together? What if they've worked tirelessly to create a space where everyone, regardless of their beliefs, feels welcome?" Sarah's frown deepened, and a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. I don't know. But that hat is just a hat," Tim interjected gently. "What matters more, a piece of fabric with a slogan on it, or the actions of the person wearing it?" Before Sarah could respond, Mark finally stepped forward, his face pale and his hands wringing nervously. Sarah," he began, his voice shaky, "I think there's something you should know." But Tim raised a hand, stopping him. "No, Mark. Let her figure it out on her own." Sarah looked between them, confusion etched across her features. "Figure what out?" she asked, her tone growing sharper. Tim smiled faintly. "Think about it. Who am I? Why do you think I'm here? And why do you think I'm asking you these questions?" The room seemed to hold its breath as Sarah stared at him, her mind clearly racing. Finally, she shook her head. "I don't understand. You're just a customer who walked in wearing that hat." "Am I?" Tim asked, his voice tinged with quiet amusement. Or am I someone who cares deeply about this place and the people who work here? It was Mia who finally broke the silence. Sarah, she said softly, this is Tim. He's the owner of the Corner Bean. The color drained from Sarah's face as the words sank in. She looked at Tim, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for something to say. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, and for a moment, she looked as if she might faint. You're the owner," she finally managed to stammer. Tim nodded. "That's right. And I think we need to have a conversation about what this place really stands for." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she set down the cup she'd been holding. I didn't know. I didn't mean to." Tim held up a hand to stop her. "We'll talk about it later. For now, let's focus on finishing the shift. But I want you to think about something. If this shop is meant to be a place where everyone feels welcome, how can we make sure that includes people you might not agree with?" Sarah nodded numbly, her mind clearly overwhelmed. Tim stepped back, giving her space, and returned to his seat. The weight of what had just happened was palpable, not just for Sarah but for the entire staff, who had been watching the exchange closely. As Tim settled back into his corner, he glanced out the window, watching as life continued outside. He knew this was just the beginning of the conversation, a moment that would ripple through the shop, the staff, and perhaps even the community. And he was ready for it. The Corner Bean wasn't just a coffee shop. It was a place for growth, understanding, and connection. Today's events were proof that even the toughest conversations could plant the seeds for something greater. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of quiet tension. Sarah went about her duties with a noticeable stiffness, her usual energy subdued by the weight of her realization. Every so often, she stole a glance at Tim, her expression a mix of embarrassment, curiosity, and unease. The other employees, particularly the long-timers like Mia, worked with cautious precision, as though afraid that any wrong move might worsen the fragile atmosphere. Tim remained at his corner table, sipping his coffee and observing. He could sense the storm of emotions swirling inside Sarah and decided to give her space to process before engaging further. He knew that rushing her would only heighten her defensiveness. The lesson he hoped to impart needed time to take root. Around noon, the shop began to empty out as the late-morning crowd gave way to the lull before lunch. Tim saw his chance. Rising from his seat, he approached Mark, who was behind the counter attempting to look busy while clearly struggling with the tension. "Mark," Tim said, his tone even. "Could we use the office for a quick chat?" Mark nodded quickly, relief evident in his expression. "Of course, Tim. Right this way." Tim glanced at Sarah, who had been wiping down a nearby table. She froze, her eyes wide as he looked at her. "Sarah," he said gently, "I'd like you to join us." Her face paled, and for a moment, she looked as though she might refuse. But after a deep breath, she nodded and followed them to the small office at the back of the shop. Inside, the room was cramped, with walls lined by shelves holding coffee supplies and stacks of paperwork. Tim gestured for Sarah to take a seat in the single chair while he leaned casually against the desk. Mark hovered near the door, clearly unsure if he was supposed to stay. "You can go back to the floor," Tim told him kindly. "I'll handle this." Mark nodded and slipped out, closing the door behind him. For a few moments, the room was silent. Sarah stared at her hands, which were tightly clasped in her lap. Tim took his time, letting the quiet stretch just long enough to create space for reflection but not so long as to feel oppressive. "Sarah," he began, his voice calm but firm, "you made a choice this morning. You stood by it, and I respect that. But now we need to talk about what that choice means, both for you and for this shop." She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with a mix of guilt and determination. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice trembling. "I wanted to protect this place, to make it a safe space for people who might feel threatened or uncomfortable by certain symbols. Tim nodded. I understand that. And I appreciate your intent. But the execution, refusing service to someone based on what you think they stand for, goes against the very values you're trying to uphold. Sarah frowned, clearly grappling with his words. But that hat, it's not just a hat. It's a symbol of a lot of things, Tim interrupted gently. To you, it represents division and harm. To me, it represents resilience, perseverance, and the belief in the potential for positive change. The truth is, symbols can mean different things to different people. What matters more than the symbol is the person wearing it and their actions. She hesitated, her brows furrowing. But doesn't creating a safe space mean taking a stand against things that could hurt others? It does, Tim agreed. But it also means creating an environment where people from all walks of life feel welcome, even those you might not agree with. If we start excluding people based on assumptions or appearances, we're no longer building bridges, we're building walls. And that's not what the corner bean is about. Sarah's face fell, and she looked down at her hands again. I didn't think about it that way. I thought I was doing the right thing. I know you did, Tim said, his tone softening. And I'm not here to punish you for standing by your principles. But I need you to understand that this shop was built on the idea of bringing people together, not driving them apart. When I opened the corner bean, it wasn't just about selling coffee. It was about creating a place where people could connect, even if they had different beliefs or backgrounds. That's the kind of community I want this shop to represent. Sarah nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping as the weight of her mistake settled over her. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't mean to go against what this place stands for. Tim offered her a small, encouraging smile. I know you didn't. And I'm glad you care enough about this shop to take a stand. But moving forward, I want you to focus on learning about people before making judgments. Take the time to understand where they're coming from. That's how we build the kind of inclusive space you were trying to protect. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and determination. I will. I'll do better. I believe you, Tim said. He straightened, signaling that the conversation was nearing its end. Now, let's get back to work. There's still a lot of coffee to serve today. Sarah stood, a faint smile on her lips. As she left the office, Tim watched her go, feeling a mix of hope and relief. She had made a mistake, but she had also shown the willingness to learn and grow. That was all he could ask for. When Tim returned to the floor, he noticed the energy in the shop had shifted. The air felt lighter, the tension dissipating as the day wore on. Sarah was back at the counter, her movements more deliberate and her demeanor more thoughtful. She even smiled at a customer wearing a t-shirt with a slogan that might have once sparked her ire. Tim knew there was still work to be done, conversations to be had, lessons to be learned, but for now, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The corner bean had faced a moment of division and come through it stronger, more united in its mission to bring people together. That, Tim thought, was worth more than any cup of coffee. The following days brought a subtle but profound transformation to the corner bean. Sarah, once headstrong and unflinching in her beliefs, approached her work with a newfound humility. Her interactions with customers became more thoughtful, and her questions more curious rather than judgmental. Tim, ever the watchful steward of the cafe's ethos, made a point to observe these changes quietly, offering encouragement when needed but giving Sarah the space to navigate her own journey. The shop's regulars, too, began to sense a shift. Conversations at tables were livelier yet more respectful, and the diverse crowd seemed to reflect the melting pot Tim had always envisioned. But not everyone was ready to let go of the incident. Whispers about the MAGA hat ordeal circulated among customers, many speculating about what had really happened and whether it would change the shop's culture. One afternoon, about a week after the confrontation, a new challenge walked through the door. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, entered the cafe wearing a jacket emblazoned with a divisive political slogan. His demeanor was confident, almost confrontational, as if daring someone to challenge him. The room seemed to hold its breath. Regulars exchanged uneasy glances, and the baristas behind the counter hesitated, unsure how to respond. Sarah was on shift, and Tim watched her closely as she noticed the man. Her initial reaction, a fleeting stiffening of her shoulders, was quickly replaced by a steadying breath and a deliberate step forward. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice calm and professional. "What can I get started for you?" The man raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her lack of reaction to his jacket. "Medium black coffee," he said gruffly. Sarah nodded, her movements precise as she prepared his drink. "That'll be $3.50, she said, sliding the cup toward him with a polite smile. The man fished a few crumpled bills from his pocket, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "No problem with what I'm wearing?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Sarah hesitated for the briefest moment, then shook her head. "No problem at all," she replied. "Everyone's welcome here." He seemed taken aback, his expression softening slightly as he accepted the cup. "Huh. Thanks," he muttered, retreating to a corner table. Tim, seated at his usual spot, felt a swell of pride. Sarah had passed a crucial test, one that might have gone unnoticed by most but spoke volumes about her growth. He decided it was time to address the elephant in the room, not just for Sarah but for the entire staff and community. That evening, after the shop had closed and the last customer had left, Tim gathered the team for a meeting. They sat around the large wooden table in the back room, the air buzzing with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Sarah sat near the middle, her posture tense but her expression resolute. Tim began by addressing the room. "I think it's time we talk openly about what happened last week and what it means for us moving forward. This shop has always been about community, about creating a space where everyone feels welcome. But that doesn't mean we won't face challenges, because we will." He paused, letting his words sink in. The incident with the hat brought something important to light. It showed us that even with the best intentions, we can sometimes act in ways that go against our core values. And when that happens, it's our responsibility to learn, grow, and do better. Sarah looked down at her hands, clearly reflecting on her role in the situation. Tim caught her eye and offered a small nod of encouragement before continuing. "I want to make something clear," he said. "This shop isn't about agreeing with everyone who walks through that door. It's about respecting them, listening to them, and finding common ground. That's how we build real connections, and that's how we make this place more than just a coffee shop." One of the newer baristas, a young man named Luis, raised his hand hesitantly. "But what if someone comes in and they're really offensive or aggressive? Do we still have to serve them?" Tim nodded thoughtfully. "That's a fair question, Luis. There's a difference between holding beliefs we don't agree with and behaving in a way that disrupts or threatens the environment here. If someone crosses that line, we'll address it appropriately. But if they're just wearing a slogan or expressing an opinion, our job isn't to judge, it's to serve with dignity and kindness." The room fell silent as the team absorbed his words. Then, to everyone's surprise, Sarah spoke up. "I messed up," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I thought I was protecting this place by refusing service, but I see now that I was doing the opposite. I was shutting people out instead of inviting them in. And I'm sorry, for letting my assumptions get in the way of what this place stands for." Tim smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's all we can ask for, Sarah, for each of us to reflect, admit when we're wrong, and strive to do better. And you've already shown that you're willing to do the work." The rest of the team nodded in agreement, the tension in the room giving way to a sense of unity. They spent the next hour discussing ways to reinforce the shop's values, from hosting community events to revising their staff training to include conversations about inclusivity and empathy. By the end of the meeting, the team felt reinvigorated, their shared commitment to the Corner Bean's mission stronger than ever. As they filed out of the room, Tim caught Sarah's arm gently. "You did good today," he said quietly. "Keep it up." She nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "Thanks, Tim. I won't let you down." As the door closed behind her, Tim stood alone in the quiet shop, the hum of the day's events still buzzing in his mind. He thought about the journey this little cafe had been on, from a dream scribbled on a napkin to a thriving community hub, and how moments like these were what gave it its soul. The Corner Bean wasn't just about coffee, it was about people. And in the days to come, Tim was determined to make sure it continued to live up to that promise. As the weeks unfolded, the Corner Bean became a hub of transformation. The fallout from the incident with the MAGA hat shifted from a divisive moment to a powerful catalyst for growth, not just for Sarah and the staff but for the entire community that frequented the shop. The tension that had briefly hung in the air like an overcast sky was replaced by an almost electric sense of purpose and connection. Tim decided to implement a bold initiative. He called it Stories Over Coffee, a weekly evening event where customers could gather, share their experiences, and discuss topics that often divided them. The premise was simple: instead of judging one another by outward appearances or symbols, people would be encouraged to sit down and talk. Tim believed that the simple act of conversation could break down barriers and foster empathy. The first event was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and the staff, though nervous, embraced the idea with cautious optimism. When the night arrived, Tim rearranged the shop's tables into a circle, creating an intimate setting. He encouraged attendees to grab a cup of coffee, find a seat, and share their thoughts freely but respectfully. To his surprise, the turnout was larger than he'd anticipated. Among the attendees were regulars, newcomers, and even some who had heard about the incident and wanted to see how the shop was handling its newfound fame. Sarah sat near the edge of the circle, clutching a steaming mug of coffee and looking slightly apprehensive. Tim gave her a reassuring nod before stepping into the center to kick things off. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice warm and inviting. "The Corner Bean has always been about more than coffee. It's about connection. But connection doesn't just happen, it takes effort, vulnerability, and a willingness to listen. That's what tonight is about. Let's talk, let's share, and let's see if we can learn something from one another." He took his seat, and after a moment of silence, a woman in her 40s with a kind face spoke up. "I'll start," she said. "My name's Marcy, and I've been coming here for years. Honestly, when I heard about what happened with the hat, I was torn. I love this place, but I wondered if it was becoming like so many other places, picking sides, shutting people out. I'm glad to see you're taking a different approach." Tim smiled, but before he could respond, another voice chimed in. It was the man who had worn the jacket with the divisive slogan weeks earlier. "I'll admit, I came in here expecting to be judged," he said, his tone measured. "I wear what I wear because I believe in it, but I know it rubs people the wrong way. I thought someone would call me out, maybe even kick me out. Instead, I got a coffee and a smile. That threw me off, and I've been thinking about it ever since." All eyes turned to Sarah, who took a deep breath before speaking. "That was me," she admitted. "I mean, I was the one who might have called you out before. But I'm trying to do better. I've realized that judging people without knowing their story doesn't make anything better, it just creates more walls. So, thanks for coming back. It means a lot." The man nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. "Respect," he said simply. As the evening progressed, the conversation became more fluid and open. A young college student shared her struggles with navigating a world that often felt polarized. An older man spoke about growing up in an era when people with differing opinions could still sit down and share a meal together. A woman who had stayed quiet most of the night finally spoke, her voice trembling as she recounted a recent personal loss and how much she appreciated having a space like the corner bean where she could feel connected to others. By the end of the night, something remarkable had happened. Strangers who had walked in with preconceived notions about one another left with a newfound respect and understanding. The atmosphere was filled with a kind of quiet magic, the kind that only comes from authentic human connection. The success of the event spurred Tim to make Stories Over Coffee a regular fixture at the shop. Each week brought new faces, new stories, and new opportunities for connection. Over time, the Corner Bean earned a reputation not just for its exceptional coffee but for its ability to bring people together in a way that few places could. For Sarah, the experience was transformative. She became one of the shop's most vocal advocates for empathy and understanding. She even spearheaded a new initiative, the Humanity Board, where customers could anonymously post notes about their struggles, hopes, or dreams. The board quickly filled with colorful pieces of paper, creating a vibrant mosaic of shared humanity that became a centerpiece of the shop. One day, a reporter from a local newspaper stopped by, intrigued by the buzz surrounding the cafe. The resulting article painted the Corner Bean as a beacon of hope in a divided world, a place where people from all walks of life could find common ground over a cup of coffee. The article went viral, drawing even more visitors to the shop. Tim took it all in stride. For him, the real victory wasn't the increased business or the glowing reviews, it was the knowledge that his vision for the Corner Bean was coming to life. He had created a place where people could see beyond their differences, where a simple act of kindness could change someone's perspective, and where community truly meant something. Months after the initial incident, a familiar face walked into the cafe. It was the man with the MAGA hat, his expression a mix of curiosity and humility. He approached the counter, where Sarah was working. She greeted him with a warm smile. "Welcome back," she said. "What can I get for you today?" He hesitated for a moment before returning the smile. "Just a coffee," he said. "And maybe a fresh start." Sarah handed him the coffee, her smile widening. "We've got plenty of both here," she said. And with that, the Corner Bean continued to do what it did best, brew coffee, build bridges, and remind everyone who walked through its doors that sometimes, all it takes to change the world is a little understanding.